the overwhelming majority of Jews were absolutely horrified by the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. They saw quite rightly this was not just another anti-Semitic government, but this was a fascist government which had a program of disenfranchisement, which rejected the position of Jews and which was determined to do something about it. So there was almost an instantaneous boycott that sprang up, which wasn't organised, but basically you don't buy German, for example. Businessmen would not order from Germany. And this coalesced by about March into an organised movement, which had the Nazis terrified because Germany was an export economy. In essence, it needed hard currency to import goods, which it then manufactured and then exported. And that's how it made its way in the world. And this movement was threatening to throttle it from the beginning. So on, I think it was March the 25th, Göring called in the leaders of the Jewish community. And at first, the Zionists weren't invited because they were a fringe movement, but they got themselves invited. And Göring basically threatened them and said, you've got to go to Europe and America to get, it was a big demonstration a couple of days later, called off in Madison Square Gardens. Well, it went ahead. But whereas the non-Zionists prevaricated and made excuses, the leader of the Zionists, Kurt Blumenfeld, volunteered that they would be more than happy to take on board opposition to the boycott, because the Zionists at no stage supported the boycott of Nazi Germany. They saw the rise of Hitler. They were the only ones who welcomed Hitler. Some quotes, Burl Katzenelson, who was the deputy to Ben-Gurion. He was a very important guy. He edited Davar, which was the Mapai, Israeli Labour Party daily. And he saw the rise of Hitler as, and I quote, an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or ever will have. And Ben-Gurion himself, the first prime minister of Israel, was even more optimistic. The Nazis' victory would become a fertile force for Zionism. I mean, some were even more enthusiastic. Emil Ludwig, who was a famous biographer and also a Zionist, said Hitler will be forgotten in a few years, but he will have a beautiful monument in Palestine. The coming of the Nazis was rather a welcome thing. Thousands who seemed to be completely lost to Judaism were brought back to the fold by Hitler. And for that, I am personally very grateful to him. And Nachman Bialik, who is the national Zionist poet, was quoted as saying Hitlerism has perhaps saved German Jewry, which was being assimilated into annihilation. Well, I think we know that although the Jews were assimilated, it wasn't into annihilation. But that was how the Zionists saw it. Because in peacetime, the Zionists could not move the Jewish masses. It needed a catastrophe, such as the advent of the Nazis and eventually the Holocaust, in order to persuade Jews to emigrate. And if the Jews were going to emigrate, the Zionists were absolutely determined there was only one place they should emigrate, because as far as they were concerned, if they emigrated to Europe, other places in Europe or America or Britain, they would simply take their anti-Semitism with them. So if there was to be a solution, they had to go to Palestine. And that was what the Zionists were extremely concerned about, was that a refugee movement, they called it refugeeism, would arise, which would try and save Jews anywhere. They were absolutely dogmatic about the fact that if Jews were to leave Germany, they had to go to Palestine. They lobbied and pressurized the Gestapo only to allow them to go to Germany. And he is a Zionist historian, Noah Lucas. He's a critical Zionist, and it was his book, I think it was The Modern History of Israel. And he wrote, as the European Holocaust erupted, Ben-Gurion saw it as a decisive opportunity for Zionism. Ben-Gurion, above all, sensed the tremendous possibilities inherent in the dynamic of the chaos and carnage in Europe. In conditions of peace, Zionism could not move the masses of world Jewry. The forces unleashed by Hitler in all their horror must be harnessed to the advantage of Zionism. By the end of 1942, the struggle for a Jewish state became the primary concern of the movement. And that was the position of Ben-Gurion. I recommend the final chapter of his authorized biography by Shabtai Teveth, The Burning Ground. It's titled Disaster is Strength. The very final chapter, and it's on the Holocaust. I mean, he was quoted as saying, disaster is strength if channeled to a productive course. The whole trick of Zionism is it knows how to channel our disaster, not into despondency or degradation, as is in the case of the diaspora, but into a source of creativity and exploitation. And he was quite clear that Jewish agency funds should only be used for rescue by immigration to Palestine. And he said rescue by assisting Jews to survive elsewhere was to be funded solely by private organisations. I think probably the quote which I use, which is most damning, is in respect to the Kindertransport. The Kindertransport was organised in the wake of Kristallnacht, the Nazi pogrom of November, I think it was 10th, 1938. Though the British had been very parsimonious in allowing Jews to come into Britain, they relented and agreed that 10,000 Jewish children from Germany would be allowed, albeit without their parents, who, of course, most of whom would not have lived. Ben-Gurion was clear. It was in a memorandum to the Zionist executive of 17th of December, and this is very widely documented. No one challenges it. It said, if I knew that it would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to Eretz Yisrael, then I would opt for the second alternative. For we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel. And then just a week later, on the 17th of December, he wrote a memo to the Zionist executive outlining the problems that the Zionists faced. And he said, if the Jews are faced with a choice between the refugee problem and rescuing Jews from concentration camps on the one hand, and aid for the National Museum in Palestine on the other, the Jewish sense of pity will prevail, and our people's entire strength will be directed at aid for the refugees in the various countries. Zionism will vanish from the agenda, and indeed not only world public opinion in England and America, but also from Jewish public opinion. We are risking Zionism's very existence if we allow the refugee problem to be separated from the Palestine problem. And that was their fear. But for the Zionist leadership, their main aim was to build the Jewish state. And you couldn't waste it by throwing all your energies into saving Jews elsewhere. That would be complete madness. The Nuremberg laws in 1935 consisted of two laws: the law for the protection of German blood and honour, and then another law which dealt with flags and so on. Basically, it stripped citizenship and nationality from the German Jews. It was done in a series of ordinances, not just Jews, also gypsies and later black people as well. They were basically considered not part of the national German collective. The Zionists were almost alone in welcoming it. They had no problems with it because they too believed that Jews were not Germans, they were Jewish nationals. The Nuremberg laws themselves had an introduction in the 1939 version, which said if the Jews had a state of their own in which the bulk of their people were at home, the Jewish question could already be considered solved today. The ardent Zionists of all people have objected least of all to the basic ideas of the Nuremberg laws because they know that these laws are the only correct solution for the Jewish people. And as the Palestine Post, which is now the Jerusalem Post, noted, the position is regarding George Koreski that anyone who offends him, because he was the leading supporter of them, he was open in his support, is liable to severe penalties. People like the Zionist executive president Menachem Osishkin was effusive. There is something positive in their tragedy, and that is that Hitler oppressed them as a race and not a religion. Had he done the latter, half the Jews in Germany would have simply converted to Christianity, because in Hungary, where it was still the case that even converted Jews would escape being deported, they were queues round the block to become converted in the ecclesiastical office. And Joachim Prinz, he later became deputy president of the World Jewish Congress. He explained that regarding the Nuremberg laws, the Jews have been drawn out of the last secret recesses of christening and mixed marriages. We are not unhappy about it. The theory of assimilation has collapsed. We want to replace assimilation by something new, the declaration of belonging to the Jewish nation and the Jewish race. A state built according to the principle of purity of the nation and race can only be honoured and respected by a Jew who declares his belonging to his own kind. And David Cesarani, who is a leading Zionist historian, observed that the Zionists saw the pressure towards segregation as a fulfillment of their assertion that Jews were a separate nation with no place in Germany. That was in his last book, The Final Solution. Cesarani was one of the major Zionist historians who attacked Perdition, which was a play about the Kastner trial. He had second thoughts about some of the positions he took towards the end of his life. The Zionists from the start were absolutely opposed to the boycott. Jews began boycotting from the start. Havarah, which is the trading agreement between the Nazis and the Zionists, was signed, I think it was the 7th of August 1933. But from the very start, the Zionists opposed the boycott. I mean, for example, Kol Yisrael, which is the Voice of Israel, the radio station, on the 18th of May, broadcast that screaming slogans calling for a boycott are a crime. And referring to a recent arson attack on the German consulate, they said, "We are all anxious about our brethren in Germany, but we have no quarrel with the representatives of the German government in Palestine." And Black goes on to say that it was amongst the kibbutzniks that there was the least opposition to the decision of the Zionist organization to trade with Hitler. So this myth of socialist Zionism based on the kibbutzim is exactly that. It's a myth, because the kibbutzim, although they were collective settlements, were not engaged in any class struggle of any shape or form. On the contrary, they were created by the bourgeois Zionists as the most effective means of colonization. And Moshe Zimmerman, a professor, spoke of the practical dissociation of the institutions of the Zionist movement and the Yeshua, the Jewish community in Palestine, from militant opposition to Zionism. So from the very start, the Zionists, together with the Jewish bourgeoisie, opposed the boycott. So in Britain, you had an alliance of the Zionists and the Jewish bourgeoisie in a board of deputies of British Jews. It's arguable that it was precisely this alliance which led to the Jewish bourgeoisie eventually adopting Zionism as a solution to the problem of German Jews. And in 1940, the first open Zionist, Selig Brodetsky, became president of the Board of Deputies. So it took 23 years from the Balfour Declaration for that to occur. But the trading agreement was very simple. It meant that if you had money in Germany, you put it into a bank account run by a company called Paltru Limited. It was frozen in that bank account. You were given £1,000 from the money you had in order to qualify for entrance to Palestine on an A certificate, which meant it wasn't part of the labour certificates which the British issued. You could enter automatically. And then the money that was frozen of yours in Germany was used to buy German goods, which therefore meant increasing the orders for German factories. And they were then exported to Palestine, where they were sold off. And then you got a fraction, maybe 30, 40% eventually, of their takings. The problem was that Palestine soon became glutted with German goods. So then Havarah went further afield. It set up other companies, the Near Middle East Company, for example, which sold these goods in the Arab countries. And you had a similar company set up in Europe also to sell German goods. So the Zionists became the kind of main sales agent for Nazi Germany. Palestine was flooded with German goods at the very same time as Jews in the United States and Britain were saying, don't buy German goods. So obviously it broke the boycott. And Hitler was not slow in pointing this out, that the Jews on the one hand call for a boycott, and yet they're the ones who are trying to sell our goods and make some money. And you Gentiles are gullible enough to believe them. So, I mean, they made hay, of course, of it. And there was a debate between Baris Velardek of the Jewish Labour Committee and Burl Locker of the Zionist Executive, where Velardek accused the Zionists of being the scab agent of Nazism. They were undermining all Jewish opposition. And leading up to the winter of 1933, the Nazi economy was extremely weak. It's quite possible the Nazis could, in that period, have been overthrown. But the Zionists had an interest in stabilising the Nazi regime. And that's a conclusion that Edwin Black draws. It's not my conclusion. And Cesaroni says in his book that it wasn't wishful thinking, that the Nazi regime was tottering. This was a fact. And a number of others, the Investors' Review, for example, also thought the Nazi regime could come to an end at the end of 1933. And that was the last thing that the Zionists wanted. They wanted the Nazi regime to stabilise, because between 1933 and 1939, 60% of capital investment in the Jewish Palestine economy came from Nazi Germany. So when I said in a Palestine seminar that the Jewish state was Hitler's bastard offspring, the Jewish Chronicle screamed about this notorious anti-Zionist once again indulging in terrible anti-Semitism. But that was true. Between the period of 1930, when the Nazi Party got 6 million votes, and the two elections in 1932, when he got 11 and 13 million votes, the main propaganda of the Nazi Party was anti-communist. It wasn't anti-Semitic. I mean, anti-Semitism was not particularly respectable in Germany at that time. And it's a myth to believe that all the Germans were anti-Semites and therefore voted Hitler into power. Hitler played down anti-Semitism almost to the point of non-existence. But in the Nazi ideology, Jews were seen as the biological parents of Bolshevism. And that was why they were merged into two. When the Einsatzgruppe and the killing squads followed in the wake of the German army in the invasion of the Soviet Union, they would merge commissars and communists and Jews together because they were seen to be one and the same almost. And that was the same with the leading Nazis as well. Communists and Jews were seen as two sides of the same coin, if you like. There was no real difference. And so for Hitler, getting rid of the Jews was to him getting rid of the origin. The Jew marks is a very frequent phrase if you read Mein Kampf, for instance. Mm-hmm. Or Judeo-Bolshevism was another phrase. So they were intertwined. But for the Zionists, of course, Hitlerism was simply about the Jews. And therefore it explains absolutely nothing, not least the support of the Western bourgeoisie. I mean, for example, Lloyd George, who met Hitler, said, whatever one may think of his methods, and they are certainly not those of a parliamentary country, there can be no doubt that he has achieved a marvellous transformation in the spirit of the people, in their attitude towards each other, and in their social and economic outlook. He rightly proclaimed at Nuremberg that in 4 years, his movement has made a new Germany. And even Churchill was on record with similar comments about Hitler. And this was the widespread view. I mean, the Times of England had absolutely no criticism of him. The BBC, which of course is now so opposed to anti-Semitism, the Daily Mail was a pro-Hitler paper, so was the Daily Express. Viscount Rothermere, who owned the Mail, was an ardent Hitler supporter and deprecated all this reference to what he called atrocity propaganda. Very large sections of the bourgeoisie supported Hitler. We had the Anglo-German Fellowship, stuffed with all sorts of corporate sponsors. There were a number of big companies, Price Waterhouse, for example, a big accounting firm. They had Tory MPs and so on. And this was, in essence, a parliamentary group lobbying in support of German interests. Anti-Semitism wasn't mentioned at the time. Anti-Semitism for them is only a recent phenomenon which comes about because of Israel.